The USS Indianapolis delivered the parts for the Hiroshima atomic bomb. 4 days after that delivery, a Japanese submarine tore the Indianapolis apart in just 12 minutes. Nearly 900 men were thrown into the open ocean. The United States Navy had no idea the ship had gone down, and it would be 4 full days before anyone came looking. By the time rescue arrived, only 316 men were still breathing. This is not a story most people know in full. Most people recognize the name from a single movie scene, the 1975 film Jaws, where a weathered shark hunter named Quint sits in the hull of a small boat and quietly describes floating in the black water after the Indianapolis went down. That scene is real. The man it was based on was real, and the horror he described was real. What I want to do today is walk you through exactly what happened, why the ship sank, why nobody came, why so many men died waiting in the water, and why the wreck itself sat undiscovered on the floor of the Pacific Ocean for 72 years. Because when I went back through the details of this story, I found myself checking the same facts over and over. Some of them are genuinely hard to believe, not because they seem impossible, but because they seem like something that should not have been allowed to happen. The USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, 610 feet long, displacing just under 10,000 tons. She was launched in 1931 and spent years as a fleet flagship, which meant she was a ship designed to carry and support senior commanders in the field. In 1936, she carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt on a tour of South America. By the summer of 1945, the Indianapolis had earned 10 battle stars for combat service across the Pacific, the Aleutians, Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She was a decorated ship with a battle-tested crew. None of that experience would matter on the night of July 30th, 1945. On July 16th, 1945, the USS Indianapolis departed San Francisco on a top-secret mission. Nobody aboard was told what the cargo was. A large wooden crate was loaded onto the port hangar deck. A sealed metal canister was welded directly into the flag quarters. Armed guards stood watch around it around the clock. Nobody was allowed near it without authorization. The Indianapolis then raced west across the Pacific, averaging 29 knots, setting a speed record for the leg between San Francisco and Pearl Harbor that still stands to this day. She arrived at the island of Tinian on July 26th and unloaded her mystery cargo under the eyes of multiple senior military officials. What the crew of the Indianapolis had just delivered were the core components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 11 days later. The men who carried it never knew what they were carrying. After delivering the bomb components, the Indianapolis stopped briefly at Guam, then was ordered onward to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where she was expected to take part in the training exercises ahead of the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Indianapolis sailed alone, no escort, no destroyer running alongside her, no sonar equipment capable of detecting submarines. The ship had specifically requested an escort for the crossing, and the request had been denied. Exactly why that escort was refused has never been satisfactorily explained. Historians have argued about it for decades. What is not in dispute is that the Indianapolis set course for Leyte at 17 knots alone in open ocean in a part of the Pacific that was still an active war zone. Just after midnight on July 30th, 2 torpedoes fired from the Japanese submarine Y-58 struck the Indianapolis on her starboard side in rapid succession. The first torpedo detonated near the bow and blew it clean off the ship. The second struck amidships, close to the powder magazine, and the secondary explosion split the Indianapolis down to her keel. Every light on the ship went out instantly. All communications failed simultaneously. With no power and no working systems, the engines could not be stopped. The ship was still driving herself forward at speed with no bow, flooding catastrophically, and there was nothing anyone could do. The Indianapolis could not send a distress signal. No radio call got out. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the USS Indianapolis rolled over onto her side and sank beneath the Philippine Sea, taking approximately 300 crew members down with her. Around 890 men made it into the water. They had almost nothing. Life jackets were available for most of them, but life rafts were scarce. There was almost no fresh water. There was no food. The men were spread across miles of open ocean in the pitch dark, with no lights, no flares, and no way of knowing whether anyone on land or in the air had any idea where they were. Nobody did, and that would remain true for the next 4 days. This is the part of the story I found hardest to accept when I first looked into it. It was not that the distress signals failed to get out. Some did. 3 separate stations either received or were alerted to distress signals from the Indianapolis, and all 3 failed to act on them. One commanding officer was reportedly drunk. A second had issued standing orders that he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. A third decided the signal was a Japanese trap, a ruse designed to lure American rescue vessels into an ambush, and dismissed it entirely. And then when the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf as scheduled on July 31st, nobody raised the alarm. The operational procedures in place at the time simply did not require anyone to report a ship as overdue. The Indianapolis had vanished from the board, and no one followed up. She was just gone, and nobody asked where. The men in the water had no idea any of this was unfolding back on land. They were focused entirely on staying alive. As the first day turned into the second, the situation in the water was deteriorating fast. Dehydration was the biggest killer. The life jackets the Indianapolis crew had been issued were designed to keep a man afloat for roughly 48 hours. After that, the kapok material inside the jackets began absorbing seawater. The jackets became heavier. They stopped providing reliable buoyancy. Men who had been holding on for days began to slip under, dragged down by the very gear that had kept them alive. Men who had drifted apart from the main groups had no one to help keep them awake or keep them from drifting away. Men who drank seawater died. Many of them drank it anyway. When a person has been in the open ocean for 2 or 3 days without fresh water, rational thought starts to break down. Delirium sets in. Men convinced themselves the seawater would be fine this time, or that there was fresh water just below the surface, or that they could see a ship just over the horizon. The salt accelerated the damage. Their bodies failed faster. They died faster. And then there were the sharks. The scene in Jaws where Quint describes the sharks is drawn almost word for word from the actual testimony of Indianapolis survivors. Oceanic white-tipped sharks and tiger sharks were drawn to the wreck site from the first night. They were present throughout the entire ordeal. Historians have debated the exact death toll from shark attacks for decades. The consensus now is that while the attacks were real, terrifying, and almost constant, the sharks almost certainly killed fewer men than dehydration and exposure combined. But even that lower estimate may run into the dozens, and some accounts suggest the number climbed well over 100. The sharks attacked at night and in the gray hours just before dawn, when visibility was lowest and the men were most exhausted. Survivors described feeling them brush against their legs in the dark. Men who were visibly bleeding were avoided by their own shipmates because no one wanted to be close to them. Groups would press together trying to look larger, trying to stay calm, trying to convince themselves not to move in ways that might trigger an attack. Nobody slept, nobody felt safe, and nobody came. There is a smaller story woven inside this one that I think deserves to be told. In 1975, a 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott watched Jaws with his family. He heard the character Quint described floating in the water after the Indianapolis went down, and something about it stuck with him in a way he could not shake. He started researching the real story for a school history project. What he found disturbed him. Captain Charles McVeigh III, the commanding officer of the Indianapolis, had been court-martialed after the war and convicted of hazarding his vessel. Hunter Scott became determined to clear McVeigh's name. That school history project eventually turned into congressional testimony. We will come back to that. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 4 days after the Indianapolis had gone down, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in a PV-1 Ventura bomber when he spotted an oil slick on the surface of the sea. He dropped lower to investigate and saw men in the water. He immediately radioed his base with one of the most understated transmissions in naval history. Many men in the water. A PBY Catalina flying boat under the command of Lieutenant Adrian Marks flew to the scene and arrived to find survivors scattered across miles of open ocean. Marks assessed the situation and made a decision that violated standing orders. He landed the aircraft on the open sea in rough conditions to begin pulling survivors directly out of the water. When the fuselage was completely full, he and his crew began strapping additional men to the wings using parachute cord. By the time rescue ships arrived, Marks and his crew had pulled 56 men out of the ocean. Over the following hours, 7 United States Navy vessels converged on the location. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the next day. When it was over, 316 men had been pulled from the Pacific. Of the approximately 1,195 men who had been aboard the USS Indianapolis when she sailed, 879 were dead. No American warship lost at sea has ever had a higher death toll among its crew. The United States government delayed making the disaster public until August 15, 1945. The same day Japan announced its surrender, and the war in the Pacific effectively ended. The sinking of the Indianapolis and the end of the Second World War were announced on the same day. The grief and the relief arrived together.